My name is Rebecca Martinez, and for 15 years, I lived what everyone thought was the perfect life in Riverside, California. Married to David Chen, a successful real estate developer, living in a sprawling Mediterranean-style house with perfectly manicured gardens, driving luxury cars, and attending charity galas where we smiled for photographers. From the outside, we had everything. But behind closed doors, my marriage was crumbling in ways I never could have imagined. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The first crack appeared 3 years ago when I noticed David coming home later and later. He'd claim client meetings, site visits, urgent calls from investors. I believed him because I wanted to. After all, his business was booming, and our lifestyle reflected that success. We'd built our dream home, taken vacations to Europe, and I'd even left my own career as a prosecutor to support his ambitions and start our family. That family never came, though. Years of trying, fertility treatments, disappointments, and slowly, David began to blame me for our childless life. I started working part-time as a legal consultant, mostly helping small businesses with contract reviews and compliance issues. It kept my mind sharp and gave me some independence, but David made it clear he saw it as a hobby rather than a real career. When friends asked what I did, he'd laugh and say I was playing lawyer to keep myself busy. The condescension stung, but I convinced myself he didn't mean it the way it sounded. The truth about David's late nights came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in March. I was organizing our home office when I found credit card statements he'd forgotten to hide. Hotel charges, expensive restaurant bills, jewelry purchases I'd never received. The dates matched perfectly with his supposed business trips. My hands trembled as I scrolled through months of evidence, each charge a dagger to my heart. Confronting him was worse than discovering the affair. David didn't deny it, didn't apologize, didn't even look ashamed. Instead, he turned it around on me. I was boring, he said. I'd let myself go. I was too focused on my little legal projects instead of being the wife he needed. And the cruelest blow. He blamed our fertility struggles on my age and stress, claiming I'd ruined our chances at happiness. Maybe if you'd been a real wife, instead of trying to prove you're some hotshot lawyer, we'd have the family we wanted, he spat during one particularly brutal argument. The divorce papers were filed within a week, but that's when my real nightmare began. David hired Thomas Blackwood, one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in Southern California. Blackwood was known for destroying opposing parties, especially women, and he immediately went to work dismantling my life piece by piece. They painted me as an unstable, career-obsessed woman who'd driven her husband away with impossible demands and emotional instability. They claimed my part-time legal work was evidence of my inability to commit to marriage, and they brought up every argument we'd ever had, twisting each into proof of my mental unfitness. When I fought back with evidence of David's affair, they claimed I was a paranoid wife who'd invaded his privacy and drove him to seek comfort elsewhere. But the worst part wasn't the legal battle itself. It was my family's reaction. My parents, Robert and Patricia Martinez, had always favored my younger brother Miguel, who was now a successful cardiac surgeon in San Diego. When the divorce became public knowledge, they didn't offer support or comfort. Instead, they immediately sided with David. "You must have done something to push him away," my mother said during a tense phone call. "David's such a good man. He built you a beautiful life, and you threw it away for what? Some fantasy about being a career woman at your age?" My father was even harsher. "Rebecca, you're 38 years old. You had a good husband, a beautiful home, financial security. What more did you want? Now you're going to end up alone with nothing but your pride." Miguel was the worst of all. During a family dinner that I foolishly attended hoping for support, he spent the entire evening lecturing me about my selfish choices. In front of his wife Sarah and their 2 young children, he told me I'd embarrassed the family with my feminist nonsense, and suggested I should have tried harder to make my marriage work. "David called me," Miguel revealed, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "He's devastated. He told me about your obsession with proving yourself professionally instead of focusing on your marriage. Maybe if you'd spent less time with law books and more time working on your relationship, you wouldn't be in this mess." The extended family was just as brutal. My Aunt Carmen, who'd always been jealous of my marriage to David, took particular pleasure in my downfall. At my cousin's wedding, just 2 months after my divorce was finalized, She made sure everyone knew about my failure. Poor Rebecca, she announced loudly enough for half the reception to hear. She had everything a woman could want, and she threw it all away. Now look at her, living in that tiny apartment. No husband, no children, just some part-time job playing pretend lawyer. It's what happens when women get too big for their britches. The financial settlement was devastating. Despite David's affair, despite years of emotional abuse, despite the evidence I'd gathered, Judge Harrison Walsh seemed predisposed to favor David's legal team. My attorney, Patricia Wong, did her best with limited resources, but Blackwood outmaneuvered us at every turn. I walked away with a fraction of what I deserved, barely enough to rent a modest two-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. My family's reaction to the settlement was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. Instead of sympathy for what I'd endured, they expressed disappointment in my poor choices that led to such a pathetic outcome. "You see what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you," my father said when I called to tell them about the final settlement. "David was generous enough to give you anything at all after the way you treated him. Maybe this will teach you some humility." The isolation was crushing. Friends I'd thought were close turned out to be more loyal to David's social circle and his money than to our friendship. Neighbors who'd once chatted warmly now avoided eye contact. The charity organizations where I'd volunteered quietly stopped calling me for events. It was as if I'd been erased from my own life. But what hurt most was the constant reminder that my family, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, had written me off as a cautionary tale. They saw my divorce as proof that I'd overreached, that I'd forgotten my place, that I'd gotten what I deserved. Living in my small apartment, surrounded by boxes of books and the few possessions I'd managed to keep, I felt like I was starting over at 38, with nothing but my law degree and a determination that burned brighter with each day of their contempt. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were busy humiliating me and celebrating my downfall, I'd been quietly building something that would change everything. The part-time legal consulting they'd mocked as a hobby was about to become the foundation of a comeback that would leave them all speechless. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received a call that would change the trajectory of my life. Amanda Foster, the state attorney general, was on the other end of the line. "Rebecca, I've been following your case," she said without preamble. "I know what you've been through with Blackwood's tactics, and I've seen your work over the years. I have a proposition for you." I had worked with Amanda's office during my prosecutor days, handling complex white-collar crime cases that required meticulous attention to detail. She remembered my work on the Morrison healthcare fraud case, where I'd uncovered a multi-million-dollar billing scheme that had gone undetected for years. That case had made headlines and saved the state tens of millions in fraudulent claims. "I'm stepping down next month to run for the Senate," Amanda continued. "Governor Stevens needs to appoint my replacement, and I've been advising him on candidates. Your name came up repeatedly during our discussions. The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. Deputy Attorney General position, with the understanding that if I proved myself in the role, I'd be the natural choice for appointment as Attorney General when the position became permanently available in 18 months. I know you've been through hell, Rebecca, but I also know what you're capable of. The state needs someone with your combination of legal expertise and personal resilience. Are you interested?" I accepted immediately. The position would require me to relocate to Sacramento and dive headfirst into high-stakes litigation involving everything from environmental protection to consumer fraud. It was exactly the challenge I needed to rebuild my life and career. My family's reaction to the news was predictably dismissive. When I called to tell them about the appointment, my mother's first response was skepticism. "Deputy Attorney General? Rebecca, that sounds like one of those made-up titles. Are you sure it's a real job and not just some government consulting position?" Miguel was even worse. "Look, I'm happy you found work, but let's be realistic about what this actually is. It's probably some administrative role they're dressing up with a fancy title. You've been out of real legal work for years." My father chimed in with his usual bluntness. "Just don't get too big for your britches again. You've already seen what happens when you reach too high. Focus on keeping this job instead of trying to prove you're something you're not." Their doubt only fueled my determination. I threw myself into the role with everything I had, working 16-hour days and studying every case file, every precedent, every legal strategy that crossed my desk. The work was demanding but invigorating. I was handling cases that affected millions of Californians, working with brilliant legal minds, and slowly rebuilding my confidence. 6 months into the role, I prosecuted my first major case as Deputy AG, a massive corporate fraud scheme involving Pinnacle Financial Group, which had been systematically overcharging small businesses for merchant services. The case was complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and thousands of victims. But I had learned from the best, and I methodically built an airtight case that resulted in a $47 million settlement and criminal charges against 3 executives. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The victory made statewide news, but my family barely acknowledged it. During our monthly family dinner, Miguel mentioned it only in passing. "I saw your name in the paper about some financial case. That's nice. How's the pay? I hope it's enough to keep you comfortable in that little apartment." As if my professional achievements were somehow diminished by my personal circumstances. 8 months later, Amanda Foster won her Senate race, and Governor Stevens called me into his office. The conversation was brief and to the point. "Rebecca, you've exceeded every expectation we had. The Pinnacle case was masterful, your work on the healthcare reforms has been exceptional, and your team respects you. I'm appointing you as Attorney General, effective immediately." The announcement was scheduled for the following week, but I decided to keep the news to myself for a few days. I wanted to savor the moment before the media attention began. Meanwhile, David was facing his own legal troubles. His real estate development company had been cutting corners on environmental regulations, and the EPA was investigating several of his projects. Whispers in legal circles suggested major violations and potential criminal charges. Thomas Blackwood was representing him again, but environmental law wasn't Blackwood's specialty, and they were struggling. My personal life was also improving in unexpected ways. I'd started dating Marcus Williams, a federal prosecutor I'd met during a joint task force meeting. Marcus was brilliant, supportive, and everything David had never been. He encouraged my career ambitions and treated me as an equal partner. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared professional interests. "You know," Marcus said one evening as we reviewed case files in my apartment, "I've never met anyone who can dissect complex legal issues the way you do. You have a gift for finding the weak spots in seemingly solid cases." It was refreshing to be with someone who valued my intellect and ambitions, instead of seeing them as threats. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family continued to view me as a cautionary tale about overreaching women, I was quietly building a career that would soon put me among the most powerful legal figures in the state. But I wasn't ready to reveal my new position yet. I wanted the timing to be perfect. That opportunity came 3 weeks later when my cousin Elena's engagement party coincided with a family crisis. Miguel's medical practice was being investigated by the state medical board for billing irregularities. Nothing criminal, but enough to potentially damage his reputation and require legal representation. During the engagement party, held at an upscale restaurant in Newport Beach, Miguel was visibly stressed about the investigation. He'd hired an expensive attorney but was worried about the potential impact on his practice. "These government bureaucrats don't understand how medical billing actually works," he complained to anyone who would listen. "They're making mountains out of molehills, because they have nothing better to do." My Aunt Carmen, never one to miss an opportunity to take a shot at me, decided this was the perfect moment to compare Miguel's real success with my questionable career choices. "At least Miguel built something substantial," she announced during the toast. "He's a respected surgeon with a thriving practice. Not like some people who chase after government jobs that probably won't even exist in a few years." The table fell silent, but Carmen wasn't finished. "Miguel's going through a rough patch, but that's what happens when you're successful enough to attract attention. Some of us understand what real achievement looks like." She looked directly at me, her meaning crystal clear. My father nodded approvingly. "Miguel's built a real career. He's contributed something meaningful to society. These government positions come and go, but healing people, that's permanent value." Even Elena, whose engagement party this was supposed to be, felt comfortable piling on. "I admire people who take risks in business and medicine," she said, raising her glass toward Miguel. "It takes real courage to build something from nothing instead of just working for other people." I smiled and raised my own glass, saying nothing. They had no idea that the government bureaucrat they were dismissing had just become one of the most powerful legal authorities in the state. In less than 48 hours, my appointment as Attorney General would be announced, and their tune would change dramatically. But tonight, I was content to let them underestimate me one last time. The press conference announcing my appointment as California's Attorney General took place on a sunny Thursday morning in Sacramento. Governor Stevens stood beside me as cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on me. I was now the chief legal officer for the nation's most populous state, overseeing thousands of attorneys and handling cases that would affect millions of lives. Rebecca Martinez brings unparalleled expertise in complex litigation and a proven track record of delivering justice for California families, Governor Stevens announced to the assembled media. Her recent prosecution of the Pinnacle financial fraud case alone saved consumers over $47 million. The news broke across every major outlet within hours. My phone started buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues, law school classmates, and professional contacts I hadn't heard from in years. But notably absent were calls from my family. They were probably too shocked to respond, or perhaps they still didn't grasp the significance of what had just happened. Marcus picked me up from the press conference, beaming with pride. "How does it feel to be the most powerful prosecutor in California?" he asked as we drove through downtown Sacramento. "Surreal," I admitted. 6 months ago, I was living in a tiny apartment wondering if my career was over. Now I'm responsible for protecting 39 million Californians. That evening, I finally received a text from Miguel. "Saw the news. Congratulations, I guess." Impressive title. Even in congratulating me, he managed to sound condescending. My parents called the next morning, their voices strained with what sounded like forced enthusiasm. "We saw you on the news," my mother said carefully. "That's quite an accomplishment." "We're proud of you, Mija," my father added, though his tone suggested he was still processing the information. We had no idea these government positions were so significant. The conversation was awkward and brief. They were clearly struggling to reconcile their image of me as a failed wife with the reality of what I'd achieved. But their lack of genuine enthusiasm told me everything I needed to know about how they really felt. 3 weeks into my tenure as Attorney General, I received an unexpected case file that would bring everything full circle. Environmental Protection versus Chen Development Group. David's company was being prosecuted for multiple violations of California's environmental protection laws. Illegal dumping, falsified environmental impact reports, bribing of local officials, and systematic destruction of protected wetlands. The case had been building for months under my predecessor, but now it landed on my desk for final review and prosecution decisions. As I read through the evidence, a grim smile crossed my face. David's corner cutting had finally caught up with him, and the violations were serious enough to warrant both massive civil penalties and potential criminal charges. The case was assigned to my Environmental Crimes Unit led by Senior Deputy Attorney General Jennifer Park. Jennifer was brilliant, methodical, and had a perfect track record prosecuting corporate environmental crimes. "This is a slam dunk," Jennifer reported during our case review meeting. Chen Development Group violated at least 14 different environmental statutes across 6 different projects. "We have documented evidence of illegal dumping, forged environmental assessments, and witness testimony about systematic bribery of county inspectors." The financial penalties alone would likely bankrupt David's company, but the criminal charges could result in prison time for him and several of his executives. The irony was delicious. The man who destroyed my personal life was about to face the professional consequences of his unethical behavior. "Proceed with full prosecution," I authorized. "Make sure every violation is thoroughly documented and every witness is prepared. I want this case to be a warning to every developer in California who thinks they can ignore environmental law." 2 days later, the Chen Development Group case made headlines when criminal charges were filed. The story detailed years of systematic environmental violations and potential damages exceeding $12 million. Local news outlets picked up the story, and David's mugshot appeared on evening broadcasts across Southern California. My phone rang that evening. It was Miguel, and for the first time in months he sounded genuinely concerned. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. This case against David's company. Do you have any involvement in it?" "The Attorney General's office is prosecuting environmental crimes committed by Chen Development Group," I replied carefully. "It's a matter of public record." "But you're not personally involved, right? I mean, that would be a conflict of interest." I could hear the worry in his voice. Miguel was smart enough to understand the implications of having the state's top prosecutor as an enemy. "Miguel, I'm the Attorney General. Every major prosecution in this state ultimately has my involvement. But this case was initiated long before I took office, based on evidence gathered through a multi-year investigation. David brought this on himself." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Look," Miguel finally said, "I know things have been difficult between our family and you. Maybe we didn't handle your divorce situation as well as we could have. But you wouldn't use your position to go after David personally, would you?" The audacity was breathtaking. After months of dismissing my career and treating me like a failure, he was suddenly worried about my power and influence. "Miguel, are you asking me to interfere with a criminal prosecution to help the man who cheated on me and destroyed my marriage? The same man you all defended and supported while treating me like garbage? I'm just saying that holding grudges isn't a good look for someone in your position. This isn't about grudges, it's about enforcing the law. David committed serious environmental crimes that harmed protected ecosystems and endangered public health. The evidence is overwhelming, and justice will be served regardless of my personal history with him." Miguel hung up without another word. The next morning brought an even more interesting development. Thomas Blackwood, David's attorney, requested a meeting with my office. The man who had torn me apart during my divorce now wanted to discuss his client's case with me directly. The meeting was set for the following week, but word traveled fast in legal circles. By afternoon, I'd received calls from 2 different reporter friends asking about the connection between the Chen Development case and my personal history. "Any comment on the fact that you're prosecuting your ex-husband's company?" asked Sandra Williams from the LA Times. "The Attorney General's office prosecutes environmental crimes without regard to personal relationships," I replied. "This case involves serious violations of state law that were discovered through a thorough investigation. The evidence will speak for itself in court." But privately, I was savoring every moment of this reversal of fortune. The family who had mocked my career aspirations, dismissed my professional achievements, and treated me like a cautionary tale about overreaching women was about to discover exactly what kind of power I actually wielded. The meeting with Blackwood was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I suspected he would try to negotiate some kind of plea deal, hoping to minimize David's exposure. But based on the evidence I'd reviewed, David was looking at potential prison time and financial ruin. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The meeting with Thomas Blackwood took place in my office on the 15th floor of the California Department of Justice building in Sacramento. The same man who had ruthlessly dismantled my life during the divorce proceedings now sat across from my mahogany desk, looking considerably less confident than he had 18 months earlier. Blackwood had aged noticeably since our last encounter. His usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain: wrinkled shirt, slightly askew tie, and dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights spent preparing for this conversation. "He'll have Attorney General Martinez," he began formally, though I caught the slight hesitation before using my title. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me regarding the Chen Development Group matter." I leaned back in my chair, maintaining professional composure while internally enjoying his obvious discomfort. "Mr. Blackwood, I assume you're here to discuss a potential plea arrangement for your client. However, I should inform you that given the severity of the environmental violations and the systematic nature of the criminal conduct, the state's position is quite firm." "I understand the charges are serious," Blackwood replied, opening his briefcase with hands that weren't quite steady. "But I believe there may be room for negotiation. My client is prepared to cooperate fully with environmental remediation efforts and accept significant financial penalties." I picked up the case file and flipped through several pages, letting the silence stretch. The evidence against David was overwhelming: falsified environmental impact reports, illegal dumping of construction waste into protected wetlands, systematic bribery of county inspectors, and destruction of endangered species habitats. The criminal exposure was substantial. Mr. Blackwood, your client faces 14 felony counts of environmental destruction, 6 counts of bribery, and conspiracy charges that could result in 15 to 20 years in prison. The financial penalties alone exceed $12 million, and that's before considering punitive damages. What exactly are you proposing? Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. During my divorce, he had been the predator, wielding power and influence to destroy my credibility and financial security. Now the roles were completely reversed, and he clearly understood the precarious position his client faced. Attorney General Martinez, I'll be direct. My client is willing to plead guilty to lesser charges, pay substantial fines, and commit to comprehensive environmental restoration. In exchange, we're hoping the state might consider reducing the criminal exposure. And why would the state consider such an arrangement? I asked coolly. Your client systematically violated environmental laws for financial gain over multiple years. He endangered protected ecosystems, contaminated water sources, and bribed public officials. These aren't minor infractions. They're serious crimes that demand serious consequences. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. Blackwood had once described me as vindictive, unstable, and unfit for marriage. Now he was begging that same woman for mercy in her capacity as the state's chief prosecutor. I understand your position, Blackwood said carefully. But I hope we can approach this matter with the same professionalism that has always characterized your legal career. The subtle attempt at manipulation, appealing to my professionalism while implying I might be motivated by personal vendetta, was exactly the kind of tactic I'd expected from him. Mr. Blackwood, my personal history with your client is irrelevant to this prosecution. The evidence was gathered through a thorough investigation that began long before I became Attorney General. The case will be decided based on facts and law, not personal considerations. Our meeting was interrupted by my assistant announcing that I had an urgent call from the governor's office. I excused myself briefly, leaving Blackwood alone with his thoughts and the overwhelming evidence spread across my desk. When I returned, Blackwood had apparently used the time to reconsider his strategy. Attorney General Martinez, I want to be completely transparent with you. David is facing financial ruin regardless of how this case proceeds. His company's assets are frozen, his reputation is destroyed, and his investors are fleeing. If this goes to trial, he'll lose everything and likely face significant prison time. That sounds like a natural consequence of committing serious crimes, I replied matter-of-factly. What I'm asking for is reasonable consideration of a plea arrangement that serves justice while allowing him to make meaningful restitution to the state and the damaged environments. I studied Blackwood's face carefully. This was the same attorney who had painted me as a bitter, vindictive woman during divorce proceedings. He'd argued that I was mentally unstable and motivated by jealousy rather than legitimate grievances. Now he was asking that same woman for compassion and professional discretion. I'll review any formal plea proposal your client wishes to submit, I said finally. But I want you to understand something clearly. This prosecution will proceed based on the evidence and the law. Your client will face the full consequences of his actions. Blackwood gathered his materials with obvious relief that the meeting was ending. As he reached the door, he turned back. Attorney General Martinez, I hope you know that my representation of David during your divorce was purely professional. I was advocating for my client within the bounds of legal ethics. I met his gaze directly. Mr. Blackwood, you systematically attempted to destroy my reputation, my credibility, and my financial security using tactics that bordered on character assassination. You succeeded in convincing a judge that I was unstable and vindictive. I hope the irony of our current situation isn't lost on you. His face flushed slightly, but he nodded and left without another word. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call that would escalate the drama even further. My cousin Elena was getting married in 2 weeks, and the family had assumed I wouldn't attend given the ongoing tensions. But Elena called personally to extend an invitation. Rebecca, I know things have been complicated with the family, but I really want you at my wedding. You're still my cousin, and this day is important to me. I was touched by her sincerity, though I suspected there were ulterior motives. My recent appointment as Attorney General had likely prompted some family discussions about repairing relationships with their newly powerful relative. Of course I'll be there, Elena. I wouldn't miss your special day. There's one thing I should mention, Elena added hesitantly. David will be there. Miguel invited him as his guest before all this legal trouble started, and it's too late to uninvite him now without causing a scene. The wedding would take place in Orange County, and by coincidence, David's preliminary hearing for the environmental crimes was scheduled for the Monday following the weekend wedding. The timing was perfect. My family would witness the full extent of my authority just days after seeing David as a wedding guest. That's fine, Elena. I'm sure everyone will behave appropriately at your wedding. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already decided to personally attend David's preliminary hearing. As Attorney General, I rarely appeared in court for routine hearings, but this case warranted my direct involvement. The media attention would be significant, and I wanted to send a clear message about environmental crime prosecution. The wedding invitation also provided an opportunity I hadn't anticipated. My family would finally see me in my new role, understand the real scope of my authority, and witness the consequences that followed when someone underestimated my capabilities. Miguel called that evening, clearly fishing for information about David's legal situation. So, this environmental case against David, how serious is it really? Serious enough that your friend should prepare for significant consequences, I replied. But you could make it go away if you wanted to, right? I mean, you're the Attorney General. The question revealed everything about how my family viewed both law enforcement and personal ethics. They assumed I would either abuse my power for revenge or use it to help David escape justice based on old family connections. Miguel, I took an oath to uphold the law and serve the people of California. I don't make criminal cases go away based on personal relationships. I'm just saying that maybe this is an opportunity to show everyone you're above petty revenge. There's nothing petty about prosecuting environmental crimes that endangered public health and damaged protected ecosystems. David will face justice because he committed serious crimes, not because of our personal history. The conversation ended awkwardly, but I was beginning to understand that my family's real concern wasn't justice or environmental protection. They were worried about being associated with someone facing serious criminal charges, especially when that prosecution was being led by the family member they'd dismissed and mocked. Elena's wedding would be interesting indeed. Elena's wedding took place at the Ritz-Carlton in Dana Point, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The ceremony was elegant, with white roses and ocean breezes creating the perfect romantic atmosphere. I arrived wearing a sophisticated navy blue dress that Marcus had helped me select, professional yet elegant, exactly the image I wanted to project. The moment I walked into the reception, conversations stopped. Word of my appointment as Attorney General had clearly spread through the extended family, and relatives who had barely acknowledged me at previous gatherings now approached with newfound interest and respect. Rebecca, congratulations on your new position, gushed my Aunt Sophia, who had previously made snide comments about my government job. We had no idea you were so accomplished. Attorney General. That's incredible. My Uncle Carlos, who had once suggested I should have been more grateful for my marriage to David, now treated me like visiting royalty. Mija, we're so proud of you. Who knew we had such a powerhouse in the family? The sudden shift in treatment was both amusing and revealing. These same people had mocked my career ambitions and blamed me for my divorce just months earlier. Now they were falling over themselves to claim association with my success. But the real tension began when David arrived with Miguel and his wife Sarah. David looked haggard. The stress of the criminal charges had clearly taken its toll. He'd lost weight, his usually perfect hair was unkempt, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his posture. Miguel approached me first, his manner cautious and diplomatic. Rebecca, thank you for coming. I know this is complicated, but I appreciate you being here for Elena. Of course, I replied smoothly. Family is important, regardless of other circumstances. David hung back, clearly uncomfortable, but unable to leave without causing a scene. When our eyes met across the room, I saw a mixture of fear, anger, and something that might have been regret. The man who had once dismissed me as a failed wife now understood exactly what kind of enemy he'd made. The reception dinner provided the perfect stage for what would become a legendary family confrontation. I was seated at the family table, directly across from Miguel and just 2 seats away from David. The placement was either incredibly awkward or brilliantly strategic, depending on your perspective. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, my family's curiosity about my new role became increasingly bold. My cousin Ricardo, emboldened by champagne, decided to probe deeper into my authority. "So Rebecca, as Attorney General, you must handle all sorts of cases. Environmental stuff, corporate crimes, that kind of thing?" "That's correct," I replied calmly, cutting into my salmon. "Environmental protection is one of our office's top priorities." David's fork clattered against his plate, but he remained silent. Miguel, perhaps sensing the direction of the conversation, attempted to steer it elsewhere. "Let's not talk shop tonight. This is Elena's special day." But my father, who had spent months criticizing my career choices, couldn't resist showing off his newfound knowledge of my position. "Our Rebecca is the top prosecutor in the whole state now," he announced proudly to the table. "She can prosecute anyone for anything. Isn't that right, mija?" The irony of his pride was staggering. This was the same man who had told me I was getting too big for my britches and should focus on keeping my new job rather than trying to prove myself. "I prosecute violations of state law," I corrected gently. "When people break environmental regulations, commit fraud, or endanger public safety, my office ensures they face appropriate consequences." David had gone pale, but Thomas Blackwood, who was attending as a family friend, tried to redirect the conversation. "Environmental law is quite complex," Blackwood interjected. "Sometimes violations are more technical than criminal. Good attorneys can usually work out reasonable settlements." I smiled at him across the table. "That depends entirely on the severity of the violations, and whether the defendant systematically ignored the law for financial gain. Some cases demand criminal prosecution." The table fell silent except for the clinking of silverware. Everyone understood we were no longer talking hypothetically. Elena, bless her heart, tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I'm just glad Rebecca is protecting California. Now who wants to hear about our honeymoon plans?" But my Aunt Carmen, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, had been drinking heavily and decided this was the perfect moment to address the elephant in the room. "You know what I find interesting," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "is how some people can go from being complete failures in their personal lives to suddenly acting like they're so important and powerful." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus, who was seated beside me, tensed, but I placed a calming hand on his arm. "Carmen, are you suggesting that professional success somehow compensates for personal disappointment?" I asked with perfect composure. "I'm saying that some people use their positions to settle old scores instead of being professional," she shot back, clearly referring to David's legal troubles. Miguel tried to intervene. "Carmen, please, this isn't appropriate." But Carmen was on a roll. "Oh, it's not appropriate to point out that our family member is using her government job to go after her ex-husband? Everyone here knows what's really happening." The moment had arrived. After months of mockery, dismissal, and condescension, my family was about to learn exactly who they'd been dealing with. I stood slowly, my voice carrying clearly across not just our table but several nearby tables where conversations had stopped. "Carmen, let me clarify something for you and everyone else here. David Chen's company is facing prosecution because they committed serious environmental crimes over multiple years. They illegally dumped construction waste into protected wetlands, falsified environmental impact reports, systematically bribed county inspectors, and destroyed endangered species habitats." David's face had gone from pale to ashen. "The investigation began 18 months before I became Attorney General. The evidence includes documented violations, witness testimony, falsified documents, and photographic proof of environmental destruction. The case was built by career prosecutors and environmental scientists who care about protecting California's natural resources." I paused, letting my words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Now, if you're suggesting that I would abuse my position as the state's chief law enforcement officer to pursue a personal vendetta, you're essentially accusing me of corruption and violation of my oath of office. Is that really what you want to put on record at Elena's wedding?" The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen had gone white. Miguel was staring at his plate, and David looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. My father, desperate to defuse the situation, attempted damage control. Rebecca, we know you're professional. Carmen didn't mean... Actually, Dad, I think Carmen meant exactly what she said. Just like you meant it when you told me I was getting too big for my britches. Just like Miguel meant it when he said I was playing pretend lawyer. Just like all of you meant it when you blamed me for my divorce and treated me like a cautionary tale about women who reach too high. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member who had dismissed and mocked me. But here's what you didn't understand. While you were all busy writing me off as a failure, I was building a career that would eventually make me one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country. And now when someone who destroyed my personal life faces consequences for committing actual crimes, you assume it must be personal revenge rather than professional justice. The reception continued around us, but our table remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. Elena, I said, turning to my cousin with genuine warmth, thank you for including me in your special day. I wish you and James all the happiness in the world. I kissed her cheek, nodded politely to the rest of the table, and walked away with Marcus, leaving my family to contemplate the reality of who I'd become and what they'd underestimated. Monday's preliminary hearing was going to be very interesting indeed. Monday morning arrived with crisp October air and media vans lined up outside the Orange County Superior Courthouse. The preliminary hearing for People of California versus Chen Development Group had attracted significant attention, not just because of the environmental crimes involved, but because word had leaked that Attorney General Rebecca Martinez would be making a rare personal appearance. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the hearing. My security detail cleared a path through the crowd of reporters shouting questions about my personal connection to the defendant. I wore my most authoritative black suit with the Attorney General's pin prominently displayed on my lapel. Attorney General Martinez, is this prosecution motivated by your personal history with David Chen? Called out a reporter from Channel 7. I stopped briefly at the courthouse steps, flanked by my security team and senior prosecutors. The people of California deserve protection from environmental crimes regardless of who commits them. Today's hearing will focus on evidence of systematic violations that endangered protected ecosystems and public health. Inside the courthouse, I was surprised to see several family members in the gallery. Miguel sat in the third row with Sarah, both looking uncomfortable but unable to resist witnessing this final act of the drama. My parents were there too, along with my Uncle Carlos and even Aunt Carmen, who avoided making eye contact when I entered. The irony was perfect. The same family members who had mocked my legal career and dismissed my professional capabilities were now sitting in a courtroom watching me wield the full authority of the state against the man they had once championed over me. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered promptly at 9 a.m. Judge Hendricks was known for her no-nonsense approach to environmental cases and had a reputation for holding corporate defendants accountable for their actions. She surveyed the packed courtroom with apparent satisfaction. The matter before the court today is People of California versus Chen Development Group and David Chen, individually. This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial on 14 felony counts of environmental destruction, 6 counts of bribery, and conspiracy charges. David sat at the defendant's table with Thomas Blackwood and 2 junior attorneys. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the charges and the reality of facing California's top prosecutor in her own element. Senior Deputy Attorney General Jennifer Park rose to present the state's case. Jennifer was brilliant, methodical, and had prepared meticulously for this moment. But before she could begin, I stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, Attorney General Rebecca Martinez, appearing personally for the people of California. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was audible. Judge Hendricks raised an eyebrow but nodded approvingly. Attorney General Martinez, the court recognizes your appearance. Please proceed. Thank you, Your Honor. The people will demonstrate through overwhelming evidence that the defendant systematically violated California's environmental protection laws over a period of 4 years, causing millions of dollars in ecological damage and endangering protected species habitats. I moved to the lectern with confidence born from years of courtroom experience and months of meticulous case preparation. This was my element, my domain, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The evidence will show that Chen Development Group illegally dumped over 200 tons of construction waste into the Bolsa Chica wetlands, a protected ecosystem that serves as critical habitat for endangered birds and marine life. The defendant falsified environmental impact reports, submitted fraudulent documentation to county planning offices, and systematically bribed 3 separate county inspectors to ignore obvious violations. I activated the courtroom's projection system, displaying aerial photographs of the environmental damage. The images were devastating. Pristine wetlands transformed into construction waste dumps, dead fish floating in contaminated water, and heavy machinery operating in areas clearly marked as protected habitat. Furthermore, Your Honor, the defendant's actions weren't isolated incidents or technical violations. They represent a calculated pattern of criminal conduct designed to maximize profits by avoiding environmental compliance costs. From the gallery, I could see my family members sitting in stunned silence. Miguel's face had gone pale as he watched me command the courtroom with absolute authority. My parents looked like they were witnessing a stranger, not the daughter they thought they knew. I continued presenting evidence for the next 20 minutes, methodically building an airtight case against David's company. Financial records showing the cost savings from illegal dumping, email communications discussing ways to avoid environmental inspections, and testimony from whistleblower employees who had tried to report the violations internally. The defendant's company saved approximately $1.8 million by illegally dumping waste instead of paying for proper disposal. They avoided $3.2 million in required environmental mitigation costs by falsifying impact reports. And they paid only $60,000 in bribes to avoid millions in compliance expenses. When I finished presenting the evidence summary, Judge Hendricks turned to the defense table. Thomas Blackwood rose slowly, clearly understanding that his client faced overwhelming evidence and an extremely skilled prosecutor. Your Honor, while my client acknowledges that certain environmental protocols may not have been followed precisely, we believe the prosecution is overstating both the extent of the violations and the intent behind them. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Blackwood was essentially arguing that systematic environmental destruction was somehow accidental or minor. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Hendricks interrupted, are you suggesting that dumping 200 tons of construction waste into protected wetlands was an accident? Or that falsifying environmental reports was a clerical error? No, Your Honor. But we believe the appropriate remedy is civil penalties and environmental restoration, not criminal prosecution. I requested permission to respond, and Judge Hendricks nodded. Your Honor, the defendant's position perfectly illustrates why criminal prosecution is necessary. Environmental crimes of this magnitude cannot be treated as mere civil violations. When corporations systematically destroy protected ecosystems for profit, criminal sanctions are the only appropriate deterrent. I paused, looking directly at David before continuing. The defendant's company didn't make mistakes or technical errors. They made calculated decisions to break the law because they believed the financial benefits outweighed the risks. Today's hearing will determine whether they were correct in that calculation. Judge Hendricks reviewed the evidence for several minutes before rendering her decision. Having reviewed the evidence presented by the people, the court finds probable cause to believe that the defendants committed the charged offenses. The case will proceed to trial on all counts. Bail is set at $5 million for the corporate defendant and $2 million for David Chen individually. The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the courtroom. David's head dropped into his hands while Blackwood immediately began discussing appeal options with his co-counsel. As court adjourned, I gathered my materials while watching my family members file out of the gallery. Miguel approached hesitantly, clearly wanting to speak but uncertain how to begin. Rebecca, we had no idea you were so competent? I suggested with a slight smile. Professional? Capable of doing the job you all assumed I was faking? Miguel's face flushed. We owe you an apology. We completely misjudged the situation. Miguel, you didn't misjudge the situation. You revealed your true opinion of me when you thought I had no power to affect your lives. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of what I'm capable of. My parents approached nervously, clearly struggling with how to address their daughter who had just demonstrated capabilities they never imagined she possessed. "Mija," my father began awkwardly, "we're proud of you. We always knew you were smart, but this is incredible." "Dad, you told me I was getting too big for my britches and should focus on keeping my government job instead of trying to prove myself. You dismissed my career as meaningless bureaucracy. What exactly are you proud of?" The question hung in the air uncomfortably. My mother attempted damage control. "We just didn't understand how important your work was. We thought..." "You thought I was a failure who drove away a good husband and was pretending to be more successful than I actually was," I finished for her. "You weren't confused about my job responsibilities. You were convinced I was incompetent and vindictive." As we stood in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the aftermath of David's legal destruction, my family finally understood the full scope of what they had underestimated. The woman they had dismissed as a cautionary tale had become one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country. But more importantly, they realized that power built on competence and integrity was far more formidable than anything they had previously imagined. "Rebecca," Miguel said quietly, "how do we fix this? How do we repair our relationship after everything we said and did?" I looked at my brother, my parents, and the other family members who had gathered in the hallway, all waiting for my response to Miguel's question. "That," I said simply, "is something you'll need to figure out yourselves. But I'd suggest starting with an honest examination of why you were so quick to dismiss me and so eager to support someone who turned out to be a criminal." I walked away with my prosecution team, leaving my family to contemplate the consequences of their choices and the reality of who I had always been underneath their assumptions. 6 months after David's preliminary hearing, the trial concluded with a conviction on all counts. David Chen was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $14.2 million in environmental restoration costs and penalties. His company was dissolved, its assets liquidated to fund the cleanup of the damaged wetlands. The case became a landmark prosecution that was studied in environmental law schools across the country. Legal journals praised the thoroughness of the investigation and the precedent it set for holding corporate environmental criminals accountable. My office received commendations from environmental groups, and Governor Stevens publicly acknowledged the prosecution as a model for protecting California's natural resources. But the professional victory, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal transformation that followed. Marcus and I were married in a small ceremony in Napa Valley 8 months after the trial concluded. Unlike my first marriage, this relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine partnership. Marcus understood my ambitions and supported my career while pursuing his own federal prosecutorial work. We complemented each other professionally and personally in ways I had never experienced with David. The wedding was intimate, close friends, professional colleagues, and a carefully selected group of family members who had demonstrated genuine growth in their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. Miguel attended with Sarah and their children, but his presence came after months of difficult conversations and genuine apologies. The process of rebuilding our relationship required him to confront his own assumptions about women, success, and family loyalty. "Rebecca," he had said during one of our reconciliation dinners, "I need you to understand that my behavior wasn't just about misunderstanding your career. I was threatened by your success because it challenged everything I believed about traditional roles and family dynamics." His honesty was refreshing, even if it was painful to hear. Miguel admitted that he had felt more comfortable when I was married to David because it confirmed his worldview that women needed men to provide stability and direction. My divorce and subsequent success had forced him to examine beliefs he had never questioned. "When you succeeded on your own terms, it made me realize that everything I thought I knew about strength and independence might be wrong. It was easier to dismiss you than to examine my own prejudices." My parents underwent a similar journey of self-reflection, though their process was more challenging given their generational perspectives. My father, in particular, struggled to reconcile his traditional views about women's roles with the reality of his daughter's extraordinary achievements. "Mija," he said during a visit to my new home in Sacramento, "I spent so many years thinking I was protecting you by encouraging you to focus on marriage and family. I thought career ambitions would make you unhappy and unfulfilled." He paused, looking around my beautiful home office with its law books, awards, and photographs of me with state and federal officials. "But watching you in that courtroom, seeing the respect you command and the important work you do, I realized I was trying to protect you from becoming exactly who you were meant to be." My mother's transformation was perhaps the most profound. She had built her entire identity around being a supportive wife and mother, sacrificing her own ambitions to raise her children and support my father's career. My success forced her to confront what her own life might have looked like if she had pursued her dreams. "I think I resented your ambitions because they reminded me of opportunities I never pursued," she admitted during a particularly emotional conversation. "When you refused to accept David's treatment and fought for your own independence, it made me question whether I had settled for less than I deserved in my own marriage." The conversation led to deeper discussions about generational differences, women's opportunities, and the courage required to challenge societal expectations. My mother began taking college courses for the first time in 30 years, exploring interests she had abandoned when she got married. Not all family relationships were salvageable. Aunt Carmen never acknowledged her role in my humiliation or offered any genuine apology for her behavior. She continued to make subtle digs about my lucky career break and suggested that my success was somehow undeserved. I eventually decided that maintaining a relationship with someone who couldn't respect my achievements wasn't worth the emotional energy. The broader family dynamics shifted significantly after the trial. Cousins who had previously ignored me now sought my advice about legal matters, career decisions, and navigating professional challenges. I became the family member people called when they needed guidance, connections, or support for their own ambitions. Elena, whose wedding had been the site of my dramatic confrontation with the family, became one of my closest allies. She apologized repeatedly for not defending me during the years of family criticism and became an advocate for other women in our extended family who faced similar dismissive treatment. "Watching how they treated you opened my eyes to patterns I had never noticed before," Elena told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "The way uncles talked over female cousins at family gatherings, the way achievements by women were downplayed while men's accomplishments were celebrated. I started seeing it everywhere." Elena began organizing monthly dinners for the women in our extended family, creating a space for supporting each other's professional and personal goals. The gatherings became a source of strength and networking that hadn't existed before my public confrontation with family attitudes. Professionally, my career continued to flourish. I was re-elected as Attorney General with an overwhelming majority, running on a platform of environmental protection, corporate accountability, and public safety. Legal scholars began discussing me as a potential candidate for federal judicial appointments or higher elected office. The Chen Development prosecution had established my reputation nationally as a prosecutor willing to take on powerful interests and hold them accountable for their actions. I received speaking invitations from law schools, environmental organizations, and women's professional groups across the country. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my success was the mentoring opportunities it created. Young women attorneys began reaching out for career advice, guidance on navigating workplace challenges, and support for pursuing leadership positions. I established a scholarship fund for women from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue environmental law careers. "Attorney General Martinez," said Jessica Rivera, a recent law school graduate I was mentoring, "how do you handle people who underestimate you or dismiss your capabilities?" I smiled, thinking about my own journey from dismissed divorce victim to one of California's most powerful legal figures. "Jessica, the most powerful response to being underestimated is to become undeniably excellent at what you do. Build your competence, develop your expertise, and let your work speak for itself. When people realize they misjudged you, they'll have to confront their own assumptions and biases." "But what about family members or people close to you who don't support your ambitions?" "That's more complex," I admitted. "Sometimes people who love you still have limiting beliefs about what you can achieve. Be patient with them if they're willing to grow, but don't sacrifice your dreams to accommodate their limitations." 3 years after the trial, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the annual California Environmental Protection Awards ceremony. The event honored individuals and organizations that had made significant contributions to preserving the state's natural resources. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included environmental scientists, policymakers, business leaders, and activists, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Environmental protection isn't just about preserving beautiful landscapes or protecting endangered species, I began. It's about holding powerful interests accountable when they prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. It's about ensuring that future generations inherit a world that hasn't been sacrificed to corporate greed. In the audience, I spotted Marcus beaming with pride, several family members who had made the trip to support me, and colleagues who had become trusted friends. But I also noticed David's former business partner, Richard Morrison, who had testified against David during the trial and was now running an environmental consulting firm focused on sustainable development practices. After the ceremony, Richard approached me with genuine appreciation. "Attorney General Martinez, I wanted to thank you for the prosecution of Chen Development. David's practices were destroying the industry's reputation, and your case sent a clear message that environmental crimes have serious consequences." "The case was about justice and environmental protection," I replied, "but I'm glad it had positive effects on industry practices." "It did more than that," Richard continued. "It showed that no one is above the law, regardless of their connections or influence. That's a lesson a lot of people needed to learn." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the woman I had been 3 years earlier, living in a small apartment, dismissed by my family, written off as a failure after my divorce. The transformation hadn't just been professional, it had been personal, psychological, and spiritual. I had learned that being underestimated could be a source of strength rather than limitation. When people don't expect much from you, exceeding their expectations becomes a powerful form of vindication. When they dismiss your capabilities, proving them wrong becomes deeply satisfying. But more importantly, I had learned that my worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition or approval. The family members who had mocked my divorce and dismissed my career were the same people who now bragged about their connection to the Attorney General. Their opinions hadn't changed my capabilities. They had only revealed their own limitations. My phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel. "Saw your speech on the news tonight. Proud to be your brother." I smiled and texted back, "Thank you. See you at Sunday dinner." Some relationships could be rebuilt with patience, honesty, and genuine effort to understand each other. Others couldn't survive the revelation of fundamental differences in values and respect. But the most important relationship, the one with myself, had emerged stronger than ever. The woman who had been mocked for her divorce had become the Attorney General who protected millions of Californians. The failure they had dismissed was now one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country. And the family member they had written off as a cautionary tale had become someone they looked to for inspiration and guidance. Justice, it turned out, came in many forms. Sometimes it was a criminal conviction in a courtroom. Sometimes it was watching people who had underestimated you realize exactly who they had been dealing with all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.